In a modest suburban kitchen, a 58-year-old widow was about to discover the ultimate betrayal. What started as checking monthly bank statements took a shocking turn when she came face to face with financial devastation. Celia Williams wasn't your typical victim. For 30 years, she had sacrificed everything for her son's future, known for her methodical determination. When she encountered empty accounts and luxury hotel charges, she had no idea she was walking into international deception. Celia made a decision that would lead to a cross-continental pursuit. What began as maternal trust would become fierce redemption. The quiet woman would never be the same. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee had grown cold hours ago, but Celia Williams hadn't noticed. She sat motionless at her kitchen table, surrounded by an array of bank statements and financial documents that seemed to mock her with their clinical precision. The numbers on the pages told a story she wouldn't believe. 3 decades of careful saving, of working double shifts at the diner and taking in sewing on weekends, of choosing store-brand everything and skipping vacations, all reduced to a series of devastating zeros. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone again, dialing the customer service number with practiced familiarity. This was the 4th call in 2 hours. Maybe this time they would tell her it was all a mistake, a computer glitch, anything but the truth that was crystallizing in her chest like ice. First National Bank. This is Jessica. How can I help you today? This is Celia Williams. Account number. She recited the numbers she'd memorized 20 years ago, when Robert had insisted they open their first real savings account. I need to understand these withdrawals. Someone has taken everything. The practiced sympathy in Jessica's voice had worn thin over their previous conversations. Mrs. Williams, as I explained earlier, all the transactions show authorized access. The account holder listed, David Williams, has full withdrawal privileges. These appear to be legitimate transactions. Legitimate. The word felt like a slap. Celia's eyes drifted to the credit card statements spread across the table like evidence at a crime scene. Hotel charges from Paris. Restaurants in Rome. Amounts that made her stomach clench. Single meals that cost more than she spent on groceries in a month. But I didn't authorize these. I would never. Her voice broke slightly, and she forced herself to breathe. My son couldn't have done this. There has to be an explanation. Even as she spoke the words, she knew they rang hollow. The evidence was there in black and white, in David's distinctive handwriting on withdrawal slips she'd never seen before. The signature was perfect. Too perfect, she realized now. He'd been practicing. After hanging up, Celia sat in the silence of her small living room, surrounded by the modest furniture she'd carefully maintained for decades. The worn sofa where David had done his homework, complaining about math while she worked late into the night mending clothes for neighbors. The coffee table where she'd served his friends cookies during high school, scraping together quarters to buy the ingredients. Every piece told the story of a woman who had built a life from sacrifice, who had chosen her son's future over her own comfort at every turn. Her fingers found the graduation photo that had fallen from one of the bank envelopes. David in his cap and gown, beaming at the camera while she stood beside him in her best dress. The navy blue one she'd worn to job interviews and parent-teacher conferences for 15 years. She remembered that day with painful clarity, the pride in his eyes, the way he'd thanked her for everything she'd done, promising he'd make it all worthwhile. The phone rang, startling her from the memory. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment, her heart leaped. He would explain everything. There was a reason, a mistake, something that would make sense of this nightmare. Mom? His voice sounded strange, distant. Background noise suggested he was somewhere crowded, somewhere with music and laughter. David, honey, I need to talk to you about the bank accounts. Something's happened, and I can't really talk right now. I'm traveling. For work. I'll call you back in a few days, okay? The line went dead before she could respond. She stared at the phone, hearing the echo of voices behind his words. Young voices. A woman's laughter. The clink of expensive glassware. With methodical precision that had served her through countless crises. Robert's accident, the lean years after his death, David's struggles in school. Celia began to piece together the timeline. The credit card statements told their own story. The withdrawals had started small, almost unnoticeable. A few hundred here and there, explained away as emergencies that never quite made sense. Then larger amounts, taken on days when David had visited, when he'd had access to her purse, her home office, her trust. She found hotel reservations made with her credit card. The Grand Hôtel du Palais Royal in Paris. The Hôtel de Russie in Rome. Places she'd only seen in magazines, their room rates more than her monthly mortgage payment. The guest names were listed as David Williams and Sophia Reyes. Sophia. She'd never heard David mention anyone named Sophia. As the afternoon light faded, Celia sat surrounded by the wreckage of her financial life, feeling something shift inside her chest. The shock was giving way to something else, something that surprised her with its intensity. Not just hurt. She'd expected hurt. Not just betrayal. That too was inevitable. But beneath those familiar emotions, something harder was taking root. A cold, clear determination that reminded her of the woman who had survived her husband's death, who had raised a son alone, who had built something meaningful from nothing. She reached for her laptop, fingers moving with surprising steadiness across the keyboard. The hotel websites opened like windows into another world, a world of marble lobbies and champagne service, and casual luxury that mocked everything she'd ever worked for. But they also provided something else. Information. Check-in dates. Current reservations. The digital trail of her stolen life savings being spent one extravagant night at a time. David was in Paris. With someone named Sophia. Living on money Celia had earned serving coffee to truckers at 5 a.m. Money she'd saved by buying generic cereal and walking to work when the car was in the shop. Money that was supposed to be her security, her independence, her small piece of dignity in a world that didn't value women like her. The realization hit her with unexpected force. This wasn't something she could wait for someone else to fix. The police would tell her it was a family matter. The bank had already made their position clear. David's permissions were legitimate, even if his actions weren't. She was on her own, just as she had been for most of her adult life. But this time felt different. This time, she wasn't going to accept what was happening to her. She wasn't going to wait for explanations or apologies or the return of a son who was spending her life savings on a woman she'd never heard of in cities she'd never seen. Celia Williams, who had never owned a passport, who had never been more than 2 states away from home, who had spent 30 years putting everyone else's needs before her own, made a decision that would have shocked the scared young widow she'd once been. She was going to find David, she was going to get her money back, and she was going to discover exactly who Sophia Reyes was, and why her son had chosen this stranger over the woman who had given him everything. The coffee cup sat forgotten on the table, its contents long cold. But for the first time in hours, Celia felt something warming inside her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something perhaps more valuable. Purpose. The kind of purpose that had carried her through every crisis before, only this time, she wouldn't be fighting for David's future. She would be fighting for her own. The coffee cup sat forgotten on the table, its contents long cold. But for the first time in hours, Celia felt something warming inside her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something perhaps more valuable. Purpose. The kind of purpose that had carried her through every crisis before, only this time, she wouldn't be fighting for David's future. She would be fighting for her own. The morning light streaming through her kitchen window felt different somehow, sharper, as if the world had shifted overnight. Celia had barely slept, her mind cycling through the evidence spread across her dining table, like pieces of a puzzle she was finally beginning to understand. The hotel receipts, the forged signatures, the casual way David had deflected her calls, it all painted a picture she could no longer deny. By 7 a.m. she was dressed and ready, her gray hair pulled back in the practical bun she'd worn to every important meeting of her adult life. The police station was only 6 blocks away, a squat brick building where she'd never had reason to visit before. The desk sergeant, a tired-looking man with kind eyes, listened patiently as she explained her situation. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration," Officer Martinez said, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who'd had this conversation before. "But if your son has legitimate access to the accounts, legally speaking, this isn't theft, it's a family matter." Celia's hands tightened on her purse strap. "He took everything. 30 years of savings. Without my knowledge or consent. But he had permission to access the accounts?" The question hung in the air between them. She thought of all the times she'd added David's name to various accounts. When he was 18 and heading to college, when he'd needed emergency funds during his early career struggles, when she'd wanted to ensure he could help her if something happened. Each decision had been made from love, from trust, from the desire to protect him. "Yes," she said quietly. "But not permission to take everything." Martinez spread his hands apologetically. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Williams. My advice would be to contact a family lawyer. This falls outside criminal jurisdiction." The walk home felt longer than 6 blocks. Celia found herself moving slowly, processing not just the officer's words, but what they meant for her options. The system she'd trusted, the institutions she'd relied on, none of them were going to help her. She was truly on her own. Back in her kitchen, she opened her laptop again, this time with different purpose. The hotel websites she'd found the night before became her roadmap. The Grand Hotel du Palais Royal showed current reservations under David's name through the weekend. After that, the trail led to Rome, to another impossibly expensive hotel near the Vatican. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. She'd never owned a passport. Had never needed one. The farthest she'd traveled was to her sister's wedding in Chicago, and that had been 20 years ago. The idea of international travel, of navigating foreign countries and languages, seemed as impossible as flying to the moon. But the numbers on her bank statements told a different story. While she was sitting in her modest kitchen, worried about affording groceries, David was dining at restaurants that charged more for wine than she spent on utilities in a month. The injustice of it burned in her chest, fueling something she hadn't felt in years, righteous anger. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer. "Mrs. Williams? This is Detective Patricia Chen with the International Financial Crimes Task Force. I understand you filed a report yesterday regarding suspicious account activity." Celia's heart skipped. "Yes, but Officer Martinez said there wasn't anything they could do. Local police handle things differently than we do. I specialize in cases involving international fraud and money laundering. Your case caught my attention because of the pattern: large withdrawals followed by immediate overseas luxury spending. It fits a profile we've been tracking." Detective Chen's voice was crisp, professional, but Celia detected something else underneath: genuine interest. "Would you be willing to meet with me this afternoon? I'd like to review the documentation you've gathered." 3 hours later, Celia sat across from Detective Chen in a small conference room at the Federal Building downtown. Chen was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they reviewed Celia's carefully organized papers. "This is impressive work," Chen said, spreading the hotel receipts and bank statements across the table. "Most people don't think to trace the digital footprints this thoroughly." "I've had to be organized my whole life," Celia replied. "When you're raising a child alone on limited income, you learn to track every penny." Chen nodded, making notes on a yellow pad. "Tell me about your son's girlfriend." "This Sophia Reyes." I'd never heard the name before yesterday. "David hasn't mentioned anyone serious in months. He usually tells me about the women he's dating." "Usually?" Celia thought carefully. "David has always been open with me. Sometimes too open. He tells me about his relationships, his job troubles, his financial problems. We talk several times a week. But lately, he's been more distant. I thought it was just stress from work." "When did this distance begin?" "Maybe 3 months ago. He started calling less, visiting less." When I asked about it, he said he was busy with a new project at work. I didn't want to seem clingy, so I gave him space. Chen made another note. Mrs. Williams, I'm going to share something with you that's not yet public knowledge. We've been tracking a sophisticated con operation that targets families through romantic manipulation. The pattern is always the same. A young woman identifies a vulnerable male family member, usually someone with access to family wealth, and systematically isolates them from their support network while draining their resources. Celia felt the room tilt slightly. You think David is being manipulated? It's possible. The pattern fits perfectly. The gradual isolation, the sudden personality changes, the access to family accounts, the expensive travel to locations that make investigation difficult. Chen leaned forward. Mrs. Williams, I believe your son may be as much a victim as you are. The words hit Celia like a physical blow. For 24 hours, she'd been processing the betrayal, the anger, the devastating loss of trust. But the possibility that David was being manipulated, that her baby was trapped in something beyond his understanding, that changed everything. What can I do? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Chen studied her for a long moment. Officially? Nothing. We can open an investigation. But these cases take months, sometimes years to develop. The perpetrators are sophisticated, and they usually disappear before we can build a case. And unofficially? Your son is currently in Paris. From the pattern, he'll probably move to Rome next, then possibly Barcelona or Monaco. If someone were to approach him directly, warn him about what's happening. Chen shrugged. It might break the spell before more damage is done. Celia understood what Chen wasn't saying directly. Someone like his mother. Someone like his mother. But I have to warn you, Mrs. Williams. These people are dangerous when cornered. And international travel, especially alone, carries risks. That afternoon, Celia sat in her living room with a travel brochure she'd picked up at the agency downtown. The agent, a cheerful woman named Susan, had explained passport applications, international phone plans, travel insurance, currency exchange. The list of requirements seemed endless, overwhelming. But the photo of David's graduation sitting on her coffee table reminded her why none of that mattered. She'd protected him his entire life. She'd worked 3 jobs to pay for his education, sacrificed her own dreams to ensure his success, rebuilt her life around his needs after Robert's death. She wasn't going to stop now, especially if he was trapped in something beyond his control. The phone rang again. David's number. Mom! His voice sounded strained, tired. David, honey, where are you? I told you I'm traveling for work. Listen, I can't talk long. I just wanted to check in. In the background, she heard the same sounds as before. Music, laughter, the clink of expensive glassware. But this time, she also heard something else. A woman's voice, sharp and impatient, saying something in rapid French. David, I know about the bank accounts. Silence. Then, Mom, I can explain. I know about the hotels, the restaurants, the woman you're with. I know about all of it. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, defensive. You don't understand the situation. It's complicated. Then help me understand. Come home. We'll figure this out together. I can't. Not right now. I'm sorry about the money, Mom. I really am. But this is important. This is my life. And what about my life? What about 30 years of saving? What about my security, my future? The line went quiet. Then, I'll pay you back, I promise, but I can't come home right now. The call ended, leaving Celia staring at her phone. But instead of despair, she felt something else crystallizing in her chest. Determination, the same fierce protectiveness that had driven her to work double shifts when David was sick, that had made her fight for his college financial aid, that had carried her through every crisis of their lives together. She opened her laptop and navigated to the airline website. The flight to Paris left tomorrow evening. One way, because she had no idea how long this would take. The price made her stomach clench. Nearly $1,000 she didn't have, charged to the emergency credit card she'd hoped never to use. But as she clicked purchase, Celia Williams felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: the thrill of taking control of her own story. She was 58 years old, had never traveled internationally, spoke no French, and had no idea what she would do when she arrived. But she was David's mother, and 30 years of sacrifice had taught her that sometimes love required the courage to venture into the unknown. Paris would have to be ready for her. The airplane's descent into Charles de Gaulle felt like falling into another world. Celia pressed her face to the small window, watching the patchwork of French countryside give way to the sprawling complexity of Paris. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the armrest, not from fear of flying, which had proven less terrifying than she'd expected, but from the magnitude of what she was attempting. 58 years old, and she was chasing her son across an ocean to a city where she knew no one and spoke not a word of the language. The immigration line moved with bureaucratic slowness that reminded her of the DMV back home, except here the officials spoke rapid French and looked at her American passport with the mild indifference of people who'd seen thousands of tourists. When the officer stamped her entry and said something she didn't understand, Celia simply smiled and nodded, clutching her small suitcase and the printed hotel address that represented her only anchor in this foreign place. Charles de Gaulle Airport was a labyrinth of signs in multiple languages, moving walkways that seemed to lead nowhere, and crowds of travelers who knew exactly where they were going. Celia stood for a moment in the main terminal, overwhelmed by the babble of voices around her. The confidence she'd felt booking the ticket in her kitchen seemed ridiculous now. What had she been thinking? But then she remembered David's voice on the phone. Strained, defensive, not quite her son. Someone had changed him, was using him, and that someone was spending her life's work on champagne and luxury hotels. The anger that had driven her across the Atlantic flared again, giving her the strength to approach the information desk. The young woman behind the counter spoke English with a crisp British accent. "First time in Paris, madame?" "Yes. I need to get to..." Celia consulted her printed directions. "Hôtel des Grands Boulevards." And then to the Grand Hôtel du Palais Royal. The information clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "The Palais Royal is quite exclusive. Are you certain of the address?" Celia's jaw tightened. "I'm certain. The metro journey into the city was an adventure in itself." Celia had never used public transportation more complex than the local bus system, but necessity made her a quick learner. She studied the colorful map with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to her household budgets, tracing the route from the airport to Châtelet-Les then transferring to reach her modest hotel near the Grands Boulevards. The Hôtel des Grands Boulevards was nothing like the luxury establishments David was frequenting, but it was clean, and the desk clerk spoke enough English to check her in. Her room was small, barely large enough for the single bed and tiny bathroom, but the window overlooked a street scene that might have been from a movie: narrow sidewalks, wrought iron balconies, a cafe where people sat at small tables despite the October chill. Celia set her suitcase on the bed and pulled out her laptop. The hotel's Wi-Fi was spotty, but she managed to connect and review her notes. The Grand Hôtel du Palais Royal was only a 20-minute walk away, according to Google Maps. David's reservation showed he was still checked in through tomorrow. If she was going to confront him, it had to be soon. The walk through Paris was unlike anything she'd experienced. The city assaulted her senses: the smell of fresh bread from boulangerie, the sound of motorcycles weaving through impossible traffic, the sight of architecture that predated her country by centuries. Everything was smaller than she'd expected, but somehow more intense, as if someone had compressed all the elegance and chaos of urban life into streets barely wide enough for cars. The Grand Hôtel du Palais Royal rose before her like a monument to wealth. The entrance was guarded by doormen in elaborate uniforms, and through the glass doors she glimpsed marble floors and crystal chandeliers that belonged in museums. This was where her grocery money was going. This was what David thought was worth 30 years of her sacrifice. Celia straightened her shoulders and walked through the front doors as if she belonged there. The lobby was even more opulent than she'd imagined. Fresh flowers and arrangements that probably cost more than her monthly utilities. Guests who moved with the casual confidence of people who'd never worried about money. Staff who anticipated needs before they were voiced. It was beautiful and terrible, and the thought that David was living here while she'd been eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner made her stomach burn. Puis-je vous aider, madame? The concierge's English was flawless, his manner politely attentive. I'm looking for my son, David Williams. He's a guest here. Something flickered in the man's expression. I'm sorry, madame, but we cannot provide information about our guests. Hotel policy. Celia had expected this. She'd researched enough online to know that luxury hotels prize discretion above almost everything else. But she'd also learned that persistence and the right approach could sometimes crack professional facades. I understand your policy, she said calmly. But I've traveled from the United States because of a family emergency. I just need to know if he's received my messages. The concierge studied her for a moment. She knew what he was seeing. A middle-aged woman in department store clothes, clearly out of place in his elegant lobby. But perhaps he also saw something else, the quiet dignity of genuine distress. If you would like to leave a message, I could ensure it reaches Mr. Williams when he returns. When does he usually return? Another pause. I believe he and his companion have dinner reservations this evening. They typically return quite late. His companion. Celia forced her voice to remain steady. Thank you. I'll wait in the cafe across the street. The cafe, a small bistro with steamed windows and checkered tablecloths, provided the perfect vantage point to watch the hotel entrance. Celia ordered coffee and a croissant she couldn't afford, using her phrasebook to stumble through basic French. The waitress was kind, switching to English when Celia's pronunciation made her wince. Hours passed. Celia watched wealthy guests come and go, called Detective Chen to report her location, and tried to prepare herself for seeing David. What would she say? How would she react to this woman who had turned her son into a stranger? Just after 9 p.m., a taxi pulled up to the hotel entrance. Celia's breath caught as David emerged from the back seat, but the man she saw bore little resemblance to the son she remembered. This David wore an expensive suit she'd never seen before, moved with a swagger that seemed forced, artificial. His hair was styled differently, and even from across the street she could see he'd lost weight. But it was the woman with him who captured Celia's complete attention. Sophia Reyes was stunning in a way that seemed almost engineered. Dark hair swept into an elegant chignon, a dress that probably cost more than Celia's car, jewelry that caught the hotel's lights like captured stars. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to being watched, admired, desired. As they approached the hotel entrance, she said something that made David laugh, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Celia's first instinct was raw, maternal jealousy. This woman was everything she'd never been. Young, beautiful, sophisticated, at ease in a world of luxury that Celia could barely comprehend. But as she watched more closely, she began to notice other things. The way Sophia's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, cataloging faces and exits. The way she positioned herself slightly behind David when they spoke to the doorman, using his body as a shield while remaining perfectly elegant. The calculating look she gave the other hotel guests, as if assessing their worth. This wasn't a woman in love. This was a woman working. David looked tired beneath his expensive facade. His smile seemed forced. And when Sophia wasn't looking, his shoulders sagged with exhaustion that had nothing to do with their evening out. As they disappeared into the hotel lobby, Celia saw him check his phone with the furtive gesture of someone hoping for a lifeline. The realization hit her with stunning clarity. Detective Chen had been right. David wasn't just a greedy son who'd stolen his mother's savings. He was trapped, isolated, being systematically manipulated by someone who viewed him as nothing more than a means to an end. But knowing that didn't make the betrayal hurt less. It didn't restore her bank account or undo the months of carefully constructed lies. It simply added another layer to the complex emotions churning in her chest. Anger at Sophia, pity for David, and underneath it all, the fierce protective love that had driven her across an ocean. Celia paid for her coffee and walked back to her modest hotel, her mind racing with plans. Tomorrow she would find a way to approach David alone. She would break through whatever spell Sophia had woven around him. She would save her son, recover her money, and expose the woman who had turned her family into another con. Paris glittered around her as she walked, beautiful and indifferent to her troubles. But Celia Williams was no longer the overwhelmed tourist who'd stumbled off the plane that morning. She was a mother on a mission, and she was just getting started. The morning light filtering through her hotel window carried the sounds of Paris awakening. Celia had been awake since 5, her mind racing with what she'd witnessed. David's exhausted demeanor, Sophia's calculating movements, everything Detective Chen had warned her about was playing out exactly as predicted. A quick check of David's credit card showed new charges appearing in real time. Train tickets to Rome. First class. The pattern was clear, and Celia made a decision that would have shocked the cautious woman she'd been just days ago. Within 2 hours, she'd checked out and purchased a ticket on the next flight to Rome. Leonardo da Vinci Airport was less intimidating than Charles de Gaulle, and the taxi ride into Rome assaulted her senses with a chaos that was somehow more welcoming than Paris's elegant restraint. Ancient ruins stood beside modern traffic, street vendors called out in musical Italian, and the smell of garlic and coffee mixed in the warm afternoon air. The Hôtel de Russie made the Paris hotel look modest. Set in a private garden near the Vatican, it radiated old-world luxury that attracted movie stars and royalty. Celia's research showed rooms here cost more per night than she'd made in a month at the diner. But this time, she wasn't intimidated. Anger was proving an excellent antidote to overwhelm. The concierge was a woman named Elena Rossi, perhaps 35, with effortless Italian elegance and flawless English. Celia tried a different approach this time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My son is staying here with his fiancée, she began, letting maternal concern creep into her voice. David Williams and Sophia Reyes. I'm supposed to meet them for dinner, but I seem to have lost their room number. Elena's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Williams and Reyes, she repeated carefully, recognition flickering in her eyes along with something else. Caution. Is everything all right? Celia asked. Elena glanced around the elegant lobby, then leaned closer. Forgive me, Signora, but are you certain about the woman's name? Sophia Reyes? Yes. Why? We had guests with those exact names 6 months ago, but the man was different. Older. French. Celia's heart stopped. You're certain? Very certain. I have an excellent memory for names, especially when there are complications. Elena paused, clearly weighing her words. Would you join me for coffee? There's a cafe where we can speak privately. 20 minutes later, they sat outside Café Greco, one of Rome's oldest coffee houses. Elena had changed from her uniform, and without the formal barrier, she seemed younger, more approachable. I must be careful, Elena began. The hotel values discretion. But something about your Sophia troubled me from the moment she checked in. What do you mean? She knows the hotel too well. The staff, the routines. Which rooms have the best views? When I asked how she'd learned so much, she said it was her first visit to Rome. Celia felt pieces clicking into place. But you'd seen her before. Not her exactly, but someone very similar. Same height, same build, same mannerisms. Different hair, different name, different man. Elena stirred her espresso thoughtfully. In my previous career, I was an art history professor. I'm trained to notice details, patterns, inconsistencies. Tell me about the other time. Elena's expression grew troubled. Last spring, she was with Marco Benedetti. He owns vineyards in Tuscany, comes from old wine money. Recently divorced, very wealthy. She called herself Isabella Moreau then, claimed to be a wine consultant from Bordeaux. What happened? They stayed 2 weeks. Very romantic, very public. She seemed to know everything about wine, could discuss vintages like an expert. Marco was clearly infatuated. Elena's voice grew grim. 3 weeks after they left together, the Benedetti family filed for bankruptcy. Fraudulent investments, missing funds. Celia felt the blood drain from her face. How much? Several million euros. A 4-generation wine business destroyed almost overnight. The magnitude hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just about her $180,000. Sophia operated on a scale that dwarfed anything she'd imagined. Elena, I think my son is her current target. She's stolen everything my family has. Elena studied her carefully. Your son seems different from the others. Younger, less sophisticated. The other men were wealthy in their own right. What would she want with a middle-class American? Celia thought about Detective Chen's profile, about how Sophia had isolated David, about the timing of his job loss. Access, she said finally. She doesn't need him to be wealthy. She needs him desperate enough to steal for her. Madonna mia, Elena whispered. She's using him as a tool. They sat in silence, watching Romans navigate their afternoon routines. But Celia's mind was racing, processing the implications. The man before, Marco Benedetti. What happened to him? No one knows for certain. He disappeared after the bankruptcy. Some say he left the country in shame. Others. Elena shrugged meaningfully. A chill ran down Celia's spine. Elena, I need to warn my son. But I don't know how without alerting Sophia. Elena was quiet, then pulled out her phone. Give me 1 hour. There are advantages to working in luxury hospitality. We know things, see patterns. And sometimes, when the situation calls for it, we help each other. What do you mean? Elena smiled, and Celia saw steel beneath the Italian warmth. Some of us have been wondering about Signora Reyes for quite some time. The hospitality industry takes care of its own. And we don't like being used as accomplices to fraud. As they walked back toward the hotel, Elena explained her plan. Room service deliveries, shift changes, the carefully choreographed dance of luxury hospitality could be subtly disrupted to create opportunities. Ways to separate David from Sophia, even briefly, without arousing suspicion. But I must warn you, Elena said as they reached the hotel's garden entrance. If she's as dangerous as I suspect, confronting her directly could be extremely risky. These people are professionals. Celia thought of David's exhausted face, the way he'd checked his phone like someone hoping for rescue. She's already destroyed one family. I won't let her destroy mine. Elena nodded slowly. Then we do this carefully. And we do it together. For the first time since discovering her empty bank accounts, Celia felt something she hadn't dared hope for. She wasn't alone. In a city of strangers, speaking a language she didn't know, pursuing a son who might not want to be saved, she'd found an ally. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. Elena's plan unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch. Within an hour of their coffee meeting, she'd arranged for a, quote, routine maintenance inspection of David and Sophia's suite that would require them to vacate for several hours. The timing was perfect. Sophia had booked spa treatments for the afternoon, clearly confident in her control over both David and the situation. Celia watched from the hotel's garden cafe as David emerged alone, looking lost without his handler's guidance. He wore casual clothes that still cost more than her monthly grocery budget, but his shoulders carried the weight of someone drowning in circumstances beyond his understanding. When Elena discreetly pointed him toward a quiet corner of the gardens, citing quote, construction noise in the main lobby, Celia felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. Her first chance to reach her son in months. David was sitting on a marble bench, staring at his phone with the desperate intensity of someone hoping for salvation, when Celia approached. The late afternoon Roman sun cast long shadows through the garden's ancient trees, and for a moment she saw him as he'd been at 12. Confused, vulnerable, needing his mother to make sense of a world that had suddenly become too complicated. David. He looked up, and the progression of emotions across his face was devastating to witness. Shock gave way to something that might have been relief, then quickly transformed into panic, guilt, and finally, a defensive anger that broke her heart. "Mom, what are you? How did you?" He stood abruptly, looking around as if expecting Sophia to materialize from the shadows. "You can't be here." "I can, and I am." Celia kept her voice steady, though every maternal instinct screamed to pull him into her arms. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about. I told you, I'm traveling for work. Stop." The word came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying 30 years of authority that made David's mouth snap shut. "I know about the money. I know about the hotels, the restaurants, the woman you're with. I know all of it." David's face went pale. "Mom, you don't understand. Then help me understand. Tell me how my son, who I raised to understand the value of hard work and honesty, could steal every penny I saved over 30 years to fund a European vacation with a woman I've never met." The words hung between them like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. David sank back onto the bench, his head in his hands. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice muffled. "Sophia isn't just some woman, she's special, Mom. She understands me in ways you never could." The casual cruelty of this statement was like a physical blow, but Celia forced herself to look past the hurt to the manipulation underneath. "Tell me about her. Tell me how you met." David's face transformed when he spoke about Sophia, taking on the glazed expression of someone describing a religious experience. "She came into my office 6 months ago. Said she was looking for marketing consultation for her family's import business. European antiques, high-end stuff. She was so sophisticated, so worldly, and she saw potential in me that no one else had ever noticed." 6 months ago, Celia repeated carefully. "Right around the time you started calling less, visiting less. She helped me understand that I was being held back by small-town thinking, that I deserved better than scrambling for scraps in a dead-end job." David's voice gained intensity, parroting words that clearly weren't his own. "She showed me what life could be like if I had the courage to take what I deserved." "And what you deserved was my life savings?" David flinched. "It was supposed to be a loan. An investment in our future. Sophia has connections, opportunities in Europe that could make us millions. She just needed some initial capital to get the deal started." Celia felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Show me these business opportunities. Show me the contracts, the investment documents." "It's not that simple. These are high-level international deals. Everything has to be handled carefully, discreetly." "David, listen to yourself. You're reciting talking points." Before David could respond, Elena appeared at the garden entrance, her expression urgent. She caught Celia's eye and made a subtle gesture. Sophia was returning early from her spa appointment. "We need to continue this conversation somewhere else," Celia said quickly. "Away from here." "I can't. Sophia will wonder where I am." "David, you're 32 years old. Since when do you need permission to have coffee with your mother?" The question seemed to penetrate the fog of manipulation surrounding him. For a moment, confusion flickered across his features, as if he were waking up from a dream and couldn't quite remember how he'd gotten where he was. He started to speak, then stopped, looking around the garden with the disorientation of someone seeing his surroundings clearly for the first time in months. But before the moment could develop further, Sophia's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "David, darling, what are you doing out here?" She approached with the fluid grace of a predator, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Her spa treatments had left her glowing, but her eyes were sharp as they assessed the situation. When her gaze landed on Celia, something flickered across her features. Surprise, calculation, then a smile that never touched her eyes. "And you must be David's mother," Sophia said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I'm Sophia Reyes. David has told me so much about you." Celia stood slowly, studying the woman who had destroyed her life with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to balancing budgets. Up close, Sophia was even more striking than she'd appeared from a distance. But there was something artificial about her perfection, the kind of beauty that was constructed rather than natural. "Has he?" Celia said, not taking the offered hand. "Because he's never mentioned you to me." Sophia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. David, you didn't tell me your mother was visiting Rome? What a wonderful surprise. She's not visiting, David said, his voice strained. She followed us here. Followed us? Sophia's tone was perfectly calibrated surprise, but Celia caught the flash of something sharper underneath. Whatever for? She knows about the money, David said miserably. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia's mask of pleasant surprise never slipped, but Celia could see her mind working behind those carefully made-up eyes, calculating angles and escape routes. Money! Sophia laughed, the sound like crystal breaking. David, darling, what is your mother talking about? The $180,000 he stole from my savings account, Celia said evenly. The money that's been funding your little European adventure. Oh my! Sophia pressed a hand to her chest in what would have been convincing distress, if not for the calculation behind her eyes. David, you didn't tell me you'd borrowed money from your family. I thought you said this was your inheritance. The lie was delivered with such smooth conviction that for a moment, Celia almost believed it herself. But David's face told a different story. Confusion, then growing horror as he realized he was being thrown under the bus by the woman he'd sacrificed everything for. Sophia, what are you talking about? You know I don't have an inheritance. You know exactly where the money came from. Darling, I think you're confused. You told me this was money your father left you, that you'd finally gained access to it. Sophia's voice carried just the right note of concern. I never would have accepted such expensive gifts if I'd known you were taking money from your poor mother. Celia watched her son's face as the magnitude of Sophia's betrayal sank in. This was the moment Detective Chen had described, when the victim finally saw the con artist's true nature. The question was whether David would have the courage to accept what he was seeing. That's not, David started, then stopped, looking between the two women with growing panic. Sophia, tell her about the business opportunities. Tell her about the import deals. Business opportunities? Sophia's laugh was genuinely amused now. David, sweetheart, I think you may have misunderstood some of our conversations. I never promised you anything like that. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. In the space of 5 minutes, Sophia had systematically dismantled every justification David had built for his actions, leaving him exposed and alone with the weight of what he'd done. You're lying, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. You said, you promised. I think perhaps your mother and I should speak privately, Sophia said, her tone carrying subtle threat. Family finances can be so complicated, and I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings. No, Celia said firmly. Anything you have to say, you can say in front of David. He's already been manipulated enough. Sophia's mask finally slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Manipulated? Mrs. Williams? I think you're the one who's confused. Your son is an adult who made his own choices. If he chose to spend his inheritance on showing his girlfriend a good time, well, she shrugged elegantly. That's between him and his conscience. Inheritance that doesn't exist, Celia said. Money that came from 30 years of my working 3 jobs, saving every penny, sacrificing everything for his future. Prove it? The challenge hung in the air between them. Sophia had played this game before, and she knew the rules. Without David's cooperation, without his admission of theft, there was no case. And she'd positioned herself as the innocent victim of his deception. But as Celia looked at her son, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes and manufactured sophistication to the confused, frightened young man underneath, she realized something important. This wasn't about the money anymore. This wasn't even about justice. This was about saving David from himself. You're right, she said quietly. I can't prove anything, but I can do something else. She turned to David, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not the successful son she'd wanted him to be. Not the grateful child who would vindicate her sacrifices, but the flawed, vulnerable human being he actually was. David, I'm going back to my hotel now. When you're ready to come home. Really ready, not because someone else is pulling your strings. Call me. I'll be here for 3 more days. She started to walk away, then paused and looked back at Sophia. And you? She said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made both David and Sophia straighten slightly. I know exactly what you are. More importantly, so do others. Your Isabella Moreau act in Tuscany, the Benedetti family remembers. Elena Rossi remembers. We all remember. For the first time since their confrontation began, Sophia looked genuinely rattled. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but the confidence had leaked out of her voice. Of course you don't, Celia replied. Just like you don't know about the International Fraud Task Force that's been tracking your operation. Just like you don't know that Detective Patricia Chen is very interested in speaking with you. Celia walked away, leaving Sophia and David staring after her in stunned silence. She'd shown her hand, revealed more than she'd intended, but sometimes the truth was the most powerful weapon you could wield. Behind her, she could hear David's voice, confused and plaintive. Sophia, what is she talking about? Who's Isabella Moreau? The hunt had taken an unexpected turn, but Celia Williams was no longer the confused victim she'd been a week ago. She was a mother who'd found her strength, and she was just getting started. The cafe near the Pantheon buzzed with evening energy as Celia sat at a corner table, watching the entrance with practiced patience. Detective Chen sat across from her, having arrived from Paris with a thick folder and grim satisfaction. You took a significant risk back there, Chen said, reviewing Celia's account of the garden confrontation. Revealing our investigation could have spooked her into running. She was already planning to run, Celia replied. I could see it in her eyes. The question was whether she'd take David with her or cut him loose. Elena appeared at their table, still in her hotel uniform but harried. They've been fighting all afternoon. Security's been called twice. She handed Chen a hotel envelope. More importantly, I intercepted this. She tried to send it through our courier service. Chen opened the envelope, revealing a USB drive and handwritten note. Her expression darkened as she read. What is it? Celia asked. Insurance. Financial records, compromising photos, recorded conversations. Everything she'd need to destroy David if he tried to leave. Celia felt something cold settle in her stomach. Recorded conversations? Your son admitting to theft, discussing other irregularities. She's been documenting everything, turning him into an accomplice. Chen's voice held sympathy. She's been planning this from the beginning. David was never the target. He was the weapon. Against me, Celia realized. My property, my remaining assets. Before anyone could respond, Celia's phone buzzed. David's name appeared, and her heart jumped. Mom? His voice was strained, barely recognizable. Can you meet me? Alone? Where are you? Café de la Paix, near the Pantheon. Please, Mom, don't bring anyone else. Celia looked at Chen and Elena, who nodded. They'd be nearby, watching. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The walk felt like the longest of Celia's life. Every scenario played through her mind, but beneath the fear was unshakable knowledge. David needed her more than he ever had before. She found him at a corner table, hunched over untouched wine. The expensive clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. Thank you for coming, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Celia sat across from him, fighting maternal instincts. Where's Sophia? Packing. We're supposed to leave for Barcelona tomorrow. Another, quote, business opportunity. He laughed bitterly. But after you left, I asked her about what you said. About Isabella Moreau, the Benedetti family. She said you were lying, trying to break us up. And you believed her? I wanted to. God, Mom, I wanted to so badly. His voice cracked. But then I started thinking about things that never made sense. How she knew so much about hotels, banking, people she claimed she'd never met. Celia waited, letting him work through it. So I looked her up, really looked her up. David showed her his phone, filled with search results. Isabella Moreau, wine consultant. Multiple identities, victims. Articles about the Benedetti family. What happened to their business? What else did you find? Enough to know everything she told me was a lie. Every promise, every plan, every reason she gave me for— He gestured helplessly. For what I did to you. The admission hung between them, raw and painful. Celia could see the weight crushing him. David, what Sophia did, the manipulation, isolation, making you believe her lies, that's not your fault. She's a professional. But I chose to take your money. I chose to lie to you, avoid your calls, let her convince me you were holding me back. His voice filled with self-loathing. She didn't force me. No, but she created circumstances where those choices seemed logical, necessary. That's how manipulation works. David looked up at her, and she saw the confused, scared child he'd been. How do you forgive something like this? How do you forgive someone who stole everything you worked for? The question cut to the heart of everything Celia had wrestled with since discovering the empty accounts. How did you forgive the unforgivable? I don't know, she said honestly. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. It's not pretending this didn't happen. It's choosing to believe you're more than the worst thing you've ever done. What if I'm not? Celia's phone buzzed with Elena's text. She's on the move, heading toward the cafe. You need to leave. Now. Celia showed David the message. She's coming. You have a choice to make right now. Come with me, and we'll figure out how to fix this together. Or go back to her and lose yourself completely. David stared at the message, hands shaking. She has things on me, Mom. Recordings, documents. If I leave her, she'll destroy what's left of my life. Your life is already destroyed, Celia said bluntly. The question is whether you want to start rebuilding it or let her finish the job. Through the window, Celia saw Sophia approaching with predatory grace, scanning the sidewalk tables. She's here, David said, panic in his voice. Then decide. Now. David looked at the approaching woman who had controlled his life for 6 months, then at his mother, who had sacrificed everything and was still willing to fight for him. The choice, when it came, was surprisingly simple. He stood up, threw money on the table, and said the words that would change everything. Let's go. They slipped out the back entrance as Sophia reached the front door, Elena's knowledge of Roman streets guiding them through narrow alleys toward safety. Behind them, Celia could hear Sophia calling David's name with increasing desperation. But David didn't look back. For the first time in months, he was moving forward under his own power, making his own choices. The real work of rebuilding their relationship and their lives was just beginning. The safe house Elena had arranged was nothing like the luxury hotels David had grown accustomed to over the past 6 months. Located in Trastevere, Rome's Bohemian quarter, it was a cramped apartment above a family-owned trattoria, with thin walls that carried the sounds of the neighborhood. Children playing in narrow streets, old men arguing over dominoes. The eternal symphony of Roman life continuing regardless of the personal dramas unfolding within its ancient boundaries. David sat on the small sofa, staring at his phone with the hollow expression of someone who had just realized the magnitude of his situation. Detective Chen had been methodically reviewing the contents of the USB drive Sophia had tried to send, her face growing grimmer with each file she opened. She's thorough, Chen said finally, closing her laptop. Financial records going back 8 months, recorded conversations, photographs of documents, even video footage of you accessing bank accounts and signing withdrawal slips. How much of it is real? Celia asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. All of it. Every conversation where David discussed taking money, every moment of doubt he expressed about the morality of what he was doing, every instance where she reassured him it was justified. Chen's voice was clinical, professional. She's been building a comprehensive case that would paint David as the mastermind, and herself as an unwitting accomplice. David made a sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so broken. She recorded everything, our most intimate conversations, moments when I thought I was being vulnerable with someone who loved me. She was documenting it all. Celia felt her heart break for him all over again. The betrayal was so complete, so calculating that she could barely comprehend the cruelty of it. David, You need to understand. I understand perfectly, he interrupted, his voice sharp with self-recrimination. I understand that I'm an idiot who destroyed his mother's life for a woman who was using me from day one. I understand that there's enough evidence on that drive to send me to prison for years. I understand that I have no one to blame but myself. Before Celia could respond, Elena burst through the apartment door, her usual composure completely shattered. She's gone, she announced breathlessly. Checked out of the hotel an hour ago. But that's not the worst part. What's the worst part? Chen asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected. She's been busy since you escaped. Very busy. Elena pulled out her tablet, showing them a series of screenshots. Social media posts, email campaigns, phone calls to local media. She's telling everyone who will listen that she's a victim of fraud and kidnapping. Celia stared at the screen in disbelief. There was Sophia, photographed in what appeared to be a police station, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face as she spoke to officers. The accompanying text, posted to various social media platforms, told a story that was both convincing and devastating. She's claiming that David and his, quote, criminal family have been running a long-term con operation, Elena continued. That she's an innocent victim who was romanced and manipulated into unknowingly participating in international fraud. She says you, Celia, are the mastermind, and that you flew to Rome to silence her when she discovered the truth. David's face went ashen. She's turning it all around, making herself the victim. It gets worse, Elena said grimly. She's provided the authorities with evidence of the conspiracy. Bank records, travel documents, even testimony from other supposed victims who claim the Williams family has been targeting vulnerable Europeans for years. Chen was already on her phone, speaking in rapid, clipped sentences to someone on the other end. When she hung up, her expression was grave. The Italian authorities have issued a bolo alert for both of you. They want you for questioning in connection with an international fraud investigation. And the media story is gaining traction. It's already been picked up by several major news outlets. Celia felt the walls closing in around them. Just when she thought they'd escaped Sophia's web, the woman had revealed the true scope of her planning. This wasn't just about stealing money or manipulating David. This was about complete destruction, leaving no avenue for escape or redemption. How long do we have? She asked. Hours, maybe less. She's given them detailed information about where you're staying, what you look like, everything they need to find you. Chen paused, weighing her words carefully. There's something else. The evidence she's provided includes financial records showing suspicious transactions from your accounts dating back 2 years. Transactions you never made. That's impossible, Celia said. I monitor my accounts carefully. I would have noticed. Small amounts, Chen interrupted. $20 here, $50 there. Spread across multiple accounts, designed to look like the beginning of a longer pattern of fraud. She's been setting this up for much longer than we realized. The full scope of Sophia's operation was becoming clear, and it was breathtaking in its complexity. She hadn't just been planning to steal Celia's savings, she had been building a comprehensive frame job that would destroy the entire Williams family while positioning herself as the innocent victim. She knew this moment would come, David said quietly. From the very beginning, she was planning for the possibility that I might turn against her. This whole thing, the recordings, the false evidence, the media campaign, it was all insurance. Insurance against what? Celia asked. Against losing control, against being exposed, against facing consequences for what she's done to God knows how many families. David's voice carried a bitter understanding. She doesn't just destroy people financially, she destroys them completely. Reputation, relationships, future prospects. She makes sure they can never recover. Elena's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and frowned. It's the hotel. I should take this. She moved to the small kitchen, speaking in rapid Italian. When she returned, her expression was troubled. The police have been to the hotel. They've questioned the staff, reviewed security footage, taken copies of guest records. They're treating this as a major international fraud case. She paused. There's more. They've been in contact with authorities in Paris and with Detective Chen's department in the United States. Sophia has provided them with what appears to be evidence of a multinational conspiracy. Chen's phone rang, and she stepped away to answer it. Celia could hear her speaking in terse, professional tones but couldn't make out the words. When she returned, her face was grim. "That was my supervisor. The investigation into Sophia's claims has been escalated. There's pressure from multiple international agencies to treat this as a priority case." She looked directly at Celia. "Mrs. Williams, I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. If Sophia's evidence is accepted at face value, you're looking at charges of conspiracy, international fraud, and money laundering. David could face similar charges, plus extortion and theft." "But it's all fabricated," Celia protested. "Surely they can see that." "The evidence looks real, very real. Financial records, transaction logs, recorded conversations. She's had months to perfect this story, and she's very good at what she does." Chen's voice carried the weight of professional experience. "Even if we can eventually prove it's fabricated, the damage will be done. Your reputations will be destroyed, your assets frozen, your lives essentially over." The apartment fell silent, except for the sounds of Roman life continuing outside their windows. Celia felt the crushing weight of how thoroughly they'd been outmaneuvered. Sophia hadn't just stolen her money, she'd stolen their future, our ability to fight back, their very identity as decent people. "So what do we do?" David asked finally. Before anyone could answer, Elena's tablet chimed with a new notification. She looked at the screen and her face went pale. "What is it?" Celia asked. Elena turned the tablet around, showing them a live news broadcast. Sophia was standing outside what appeared to be the American embassy, speaking to reporters with the composed grief of a perfect victim. "She's holding a press conference," Elena said. "She's about to tell the world her version of what happened." They watched in horrified fascination as Sophia, dressed in conservative clothes that made her look younger and more vulnerable, addressed the cameras with just the right combination of courage and trauma. "I came to Europe for what I thought was a romantic adventure," she was saying, her voice breaking slightly. "I had no idea I was being used as a pawn in an elaborate financial conspiracy. When I discovered the truth about what the Williams family was doing, using me to access European financial systems, targeting innocent families, I knew I had to come forward, despite the personal cost." The reporter asked about the evidence, and Sophia produced documents with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment extensively. "I have financial records showing transactions going back years. Recorded conversations where they discuss targeting European families with elderly patriarchs, using romantic manipulation to gain access to family wealth. The scope of their operation is truly shocking." "She's destroying us in real time," David said, his voice hollow. "And there's nothing we can do to stop it," Celia added. But Elena was studying the broadcast with the intensity of someone who had spotted something important. "Wait," she said suddenly. "Look at the background. Where is she giving this press conference?" Chen squinted at the screen. "Looks like the American embassy. Why?" "Because," Elena said, a smile beginning to play at the corners of her mouth, "the American embassy is in a very specific part of Rome, and I happen to know that area very well." She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. "Sophia has made her first real mistake. She's gotten cocky." "What do you mean?" Celia asked. Elena looked up from her phone, and for the first time since their ordeal began, her expression was genuinely hopeful. "I mean that while she's been busy destroying your reputations, she's also revealed exactly where she is and what her next moves will be. And unlike her, we have something she doesn't." "What's that?" "We have the truth. And more importantly," Elena's smile widened, "we have Marco Benedetti." She held up her phone, showing them a text message thread. "He's been tracking her movements for 2 years, waiting for exactly this moment. And he's been very, very patient." For the first time since escaping the cafe, Celia felt something that might have been hope beginning to stir in her chest. The fight was far from over, but maybe, just maybe, they weren't as outgunned as they'd thought. Sophia's gambit was impressive, But she'd underestimated the determination of the people she'd destroyed. And that, Celia thought with grim satisfaction, might finally be the opening they needed. Marco Benedetti arrived at the safe house like a man carrying old ghosts. Tall and lean, with silver threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, he moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to trust easily. When he shook Celia's hand, his grip was firm, but his eyes held the hollow recognition of someone who understood exactly what she'd been through. "Senora Williams," he said in accented English, "I am sorry we meet under these circumstances. But I am not sorry that we finally have the chance to stop her." Elena had cleared the small kitchen table, and Marco spread out documents, photographs, and electronic devices with methodical care, a man who had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. "Isabella Moreau," he began, pointing to a photograph of Sophia with different hair and clothing, "destroyed my family's wine business in 6 weeks. 4 generations of work, gone. My father died thinking his son was a criminal." David winced at the parallel. "How did she do it?" "The same way she did it to you. Romance, isolation, gradual manipulation until I believed stealing from my own family was justified." Marco's voice carried bitter self-recrimination. "But unlike you, I didn't have anyone to pull me back. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late." Detective Chen leaned forward, studying the documents. "You've been tracking her for 2 years? Every move, every identity, every victim. The authorities wouldn't listen. She'd covered her tracks too well. But I knew she would do it again." Marco pulled out a tablet showing a detailed timeline. Barcelona, Monaco, Nice, Milan. Always the same pattern. "How many victims?" Celia asked. "That I can prove?" 7 families, including yours. Total losses exceed 15 million euros. Marco's expression darkened. "But I suspect there are more. People too ashamed to come forward, too destroyed to fight back." Elena monitored news feeds on her phone. "The story is spreading. She's being positioned as the brave whistleblower who exposed an international crime family." "Let them," Marco said with quiet confidence. "Because while she's been playing victim for cameras, she's also been making the same mistakes she always makes when she thinks she's won." He pulled out a modified smartphone showing multiple data streams. "Greed and arrogance. Look." The screen showed banking transactions from the past 6 hours. Sophia had been moving money, lots of it, from accounts across Europe into offshore holdings. "She's liquidating," Chen realized. "Pulling out all her assets. Including money stolen from previous victims," Marco added. "Money hidden in accounts she thought no one could trace." "How do you have access to this?" Chen asked. Marco smiled grimly. "When you lose everything to someone like Sophia, you learn skills you never thought you'd need. I've spent 2 years becoming very good at financial forensics. All perfectly legal. I'm tracking money stolen from my family." David studied the transaction logs with growing understanding. "She's preparing to disappear completely." "Which means," Elena said, "she's going to make one final move to ensure there are no loose ends." The implication hung in the air like a threat. Sophia couldn't simply disappear while David and Celia were alive to tell their story. "She's going to try to finish us," Celia said quietly. "Yes," Marco agreed. "But that's when she'll be most vulnerable. When she moves from defense to offense, she'll have to expose herself." Chen's phone buzzed urgently. She stepped away, and when she returned, her expression was grim. "Italian police have issued arrest warrants for both of you. International fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. They're coordinating with Interpol." "How long do we have?" Elena asked. "Hours, maybe less." "Citywide search." David stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "This is insane. We're running from police while the real criminal gives interviews to international media." "David," his mother said quietly, "we knew this would get worse before it got better." "Did we?" Maybe I should turn myself in, tell them the truth. They won't believe the truth, Marco interrupted. Not when the lies are so well constructed. I tried that approach. It doesn't work. So what does work? David's voice cracked with frustration. Marco looked at him with something like sympathy. You make her come to you. On your terms, where the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Elena's tablet chimed with another news alert. Sophia was being interviewed by a major international network, her story gaining momentum with each retelling. She's getting more confident, Elena observed. Look at her body language. She's actually enjoying this. Celia studied the broadcast, seeing past Sophia's performance to the calculating predator underneath. She thinks she's won. She thinks we're too scared to fight back. Are we? David asked. The question hung in the small apartment, challenging each of them to decide what they were willing to risk for the truth. Celia looked at her son, really looked at him, seeing not the manipulated victim or guilty thief, but the young man she'd raised to understand right from wrong. No, she said finally, we're not. Marco smiled for the first time since arriving. Good, because I have a plan. He pulled out a detailed map of Rome, marking locations with colored pins. Sophia is staying at the Hotel Hassler, near the Spanish Steps. Tomorrow morning, she has a scheduled BBC interview at their Rome bureau. She'll travel by private car, same route she's used for 3 days. How do you know all this? Chen asked. Because I've been watching her longer than she's been watching you. She's a creature of habit when she thinks she's safe. Marco's finger traced a route on the map. Here's where we intercept her. Not to confront her, that's what she expects, but to force her into a situation where she has to choose between maintaining her cover story and protecting her real assets. Elena studied the plan. You want to force her to reveal herself. Exactly. She can play victim as long as she thinks her money is safe. But if she believes someone is about to expose her financial network, steal her hidden assets, she'll drop the act and show her true nature. In public? David asked. In front of cameras. International media cameras already following her story. Marco's smile was sharp as a blade. We give them a better story. Chen shook her head. This is extremely dangerous. If it goes wrong, you'll all be fugitives facing additional charges. We're already fugitives, Celia pointed out. At least this way, we're not running blind. David moved from the window, his decision crystallizing. What do you need me to do? You sure about this? Celia asked her son. David looked at her with an expression that reminded her of the determined child he'd been, the one who'd insisted on walking her to work when money was tight. She destroyed our family, Mom. She used me to hurt you, to steal everything you worked for. And now she's trying to destroy other families while making herself look like a hero. His voice carried strength she hadn't heard in months. I'm sure. Marco began outlining details, but Celia found herself studying her son's face instead. Somewhere between the shock of revelation and the fear of pursuit, David had begun to find himself again. Not the entitled young man susceptible to manipulation, not the broken victim who'd discovered betrayal, but someone newer and stronger. There's something else, Marco said, pulling out a final document. While Sophia has been busy framing you, she's also been setting up her next targets. A family in Barcelona, another in Geneva. She's not planning to disappear, she's planning to expand. The revelation hit Celia like a physical blow. It wasn't enough that Sophia had destroyed their lives. She was already planning to destroy others. How many more families is she going to ruin? David asked. As many as it takes to satisfy her greed, Marco replied. Unless we stop her tomorrow. Elena looked up from her tablet, monitoring police communications. Decision time. They've narrowed the search to Trastevere. We have maybe an hour before they start going door to door. Celia looked around the small apartment that had become their refuge, at the unlikely group of allies who had rallied to help them fight back. Detective Chen with her professional expertise, Elena with her insider knowledge, Marco with his patience and planning, and David with his hard-won understanding of manipulation. All right, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Let's go stop her. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the safe house, Celia felt something she hadn't experienced since discovering her empty bank accounts. Genuine hope. Not desperate hope clinging to impossible odds, but solid confidence of someone who had allies, a plan, and most importantly, the truth on her side. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or catastrophe. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Celia Williams felt like they had a fighting chance. The Piazza d'España buzzed with its usual morning chaos, tourists climbing the Spanish Steps, street vendors hawking souvenirs, the eternal dance of Roman commerce playing out under an October sky that seemed impossibly blue. But beneath the surface normalcy, tensions crackled like electricity before a storm. Celia sat at a cafe table with a perfect view of the Hotel Hassler's entrance, her hands steady around a cup of espresso despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. 3 days ago, she'd been a frightened woman fleeing through back alleys. Now, she felt the quiet confidence of someone who had allies, a plan, and most importantly, nothing left to lose. Elena sat beside her, playing the role of tourist with practiced ease, her tablet discreetly angled to monitor the live news feeds that had been covering Sophia's story. Marco was positioned across the piazza, his modified surveillance equipment hidden behind the facade of a morning newspaper. Detective Chen had taken the biggest risk of all. She was inside the BBC's temporary broadcast setup, using her credentials to gain access as a consulting expert on international fraud cases. David was the wild card, the piece of Marco's plan that could either expose Sophia completely or destroy them all. He stood near the base of the Spanish Steps, just another young American tourist in expensive clothes. But Celia could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand kept checking the pocket where he carried the evidence that would either save or damn them. "Movement," Elena said quietly, her eyes on the hotel entrance. Sophia emerged from the Hotel Hassler like royalty greeting her subjects. She wore a conservative navy suit that made her look younger and more vulnerable, her hair styled in a way that suggested both competence and fragility. The small entourage surrounding her included her lawyer, a media handler, and 2 Italian police officers who had been assigned to ensure her safety during the ongoing investigation. The irony wasn't lost on Celia. Sophia was being protected by the same authorities who were hunting David and her as international criminals. "She's early," Marco's voice crackled through their earpieces, 15 minutes ahead of schedule. "Doesn't matter," Chen's voice replied from inside the BBC setup. "We're ready." Celia watched as Sophia approached the news van, her performance of brave victimhood flawless. To anyone observing the scene, she was exactly what she claimed to be, a young woman who had narrowly escaped becoming an accomplice to international fraud, courageously coming forward despite personal risk. But Celia had learned to see past surfaces over the past week. She noticed how Sophia's eyes constantly scanned the crowd, cataloging faces and escape routes. She saw the way the woman positioned herself to use her police escorts as shields. Most tellingly, she observed the slight tension in Sophia's jaw when her phone buzzed with what appeared to be urgent messages. "She's getting the alerts," Marco confirmed. "Account freezes, transaction blocks, asset seizures. My friends in financial intelligence have been very busy this morning." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. While Sophia had been busy playing victim for the international media, Marco had been systematically exposing her hidden financial network to authorities across Europe. Swiss accounts, Cayman holdings, Luxembourg trusts. 2 years of careful investigation had mapped every dollar of her stolen wealth. "She doesn't know yet," Elena observed, watching Sophia's demeanor. "She thinks those are routine banking notifications." "Give it 30 seconds, Marco said grimly. Celia held her breath as Sophia paused outside the BBC van, checking her phone with the casual confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, everything changed. Sophia's face went pale, her perfectly composed expression cracking as the reality of what was happening hit her. 14 offshore accounts, frozen simultaneously. 23 million euros in stolen assets, now locked down by international banking authorities. 2 years of careful financial planning, destroyed in a single coordinated strike. "She knows," Chen said from inside the broadcast van. She's trying to make excuses to leave. But it was too late for retreat. The BBC interview was live. International media was watching, and Sophia's only choice was to maintain her cover story or abandon it entirely. That's when David made his move. He walked toward the media setup with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, his expensive clothes and familiar face allowing him to pass through the loose security perimeter without challenge. When Sophia saw him approaching, her mask of controlled vulnerability slipped entirely. "David?" Her voice carried across the piazza, confusion and panic warring in her tone. "What are you doing here? I thought you were in hiding?" David's voice was clear, audible to the microphones and cameras that had been focused on Sophia. "I was, running from charges you helped fabricate, living like a criminal because of lies you told." The BBC reporter, sensing a dramatic turn in the story, immediately redirected the cameras toward David. "Sir, can you identify yourself? Are you involved in this investigation?" "I'm David Williams," he said, looking directly into the camera, "and I'm here to tell the truth about what Sophia Reyes really is." Sophia's lawyer immediately tried to intervene, but the damage was done. The live international broadcast had just taken an unexpected turn, and viewers across Europe were about to hear a very different version of recent events. "David, don't do this," Sophia said, her voice carrying a note of desperate manipulation. "You're confused, you're scared. These people have filled your head with lies." "No," David interrupted, his voice stronger than Celia had heard it in months. "You filled my head with lies. For 6 months, you convinced me that stealing from my mother was justified, that destroying my family was necessary, that you loved me when all you wanted was access to money that wasn't mine to give." The crowd around the media setup had grown larger, drawn by the drama unfolding in real time. Celia could see Italian police officers speaking urgently into their radios, torn between their orders to protect Sophia and the rapidly evolving situation. "I have evidence," David continued, pulling out a tablet that Marco had prepared. "Bank records, transaction logs, recorded conversations. All of it proving that Sophia Reyes has been operating under multiple identities across Europe, targeting vulnerable men and stealing from their families." Sophia's composure finally cracked completely. "You stupid boy," she snarled, all pretense of victimhood evaporating. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you understand the kind of people you're dealing with?" The transformation was stunning to witness. In the space of seconds, the vulnerable young woman who had been telling her story to international media became something else entirely: cold, calculating, dangerous. "There it is," Elena whispered, "the real Sophia Reyes." But Sophia wasn't finished. With the skill of someone who had talked her way out of impossible situations before, she immediately began attempting damage control. "This is exactly what I warned you about," she said, turning back to the cameras with renewed composure. "The Williams family is desperate. They're trying to discredit me before I can expose the full scope of their operation. David has been manipulated by his criminal mother." "My criminal mother," David interrupted, "who worked 3 jobs to put me through college. Who saved every penny for 30 years so I could have a future. Who flew to Europe for the first time in her life because she was worried about her son." He gestured toward the cafe where Celia sat and, for a moment, the cameras followed his gaze. Celia found herself looking directly into lenses that would broadcast her image across continents, and instead of fear, she felt something like peace. "There she is," David said. "Celia Williams. 58 years old, widow, former diner waitress. International criminal mastermind." His voice carried bitter irony. "Look at her and tell me who you think is the real victim here." The contrast was devastating. Sophia in her expensive suit and perfect makeup, surrounded by lawyers and handlers, claiming victimhood while clearly possessing resources that belied her story. And Celia sitting quietly at a cafe table in clothes she'd probably owned for years, looking exactly like what she was, a working-class woman who had been thrust into circumstances beyond her understanding. "Ma'am," the BBC reporter called out, "would you be willing to comment?" Celia stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything they had worked for, everything they had risked, came down to this. Her chance to tell the truth to the world. "My name is Celia Williams," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the piazza. "6 months ago, my son met a woman who convinced him that stealing my life savings was an act of love. Today, I'm here to get my boy back." The simple honesty of it, delivered without drama or manipulation, was more powerful than any of Sophia's carefully constructed lies. In that moment, watching the crowd's reaction, seeing the uncertainty creeping into the police officers' faces, Celia knew they had won. Not the money, that would take months of legal proceedings to recover. Not their reputations, those would take years to fully rebuild. But they had won something more important. The truth was finally being told, and the world was listening. The community center in Cedar Falls looked exactly the same as it had when Celia was a child. The same institutional green paint, the same folding chairs arranged in careful circles, the same fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly pale. But everything else about her life had changed so dramatically that walking into the familiar space felt like stepping through a portal between two different worlds. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Celia said, looking out at the faces gathered for the Elder Fraud Prevention Workshop. 23 people had shown up, more than she'd expected for a Tuesday evening in a town where most folks were in bed by 9. "My name is Celia Williams, and 6 months ago I lost everything I'd saved over 30 years to a sophisticated con artist who used my own son to steal from me." The words came easier now than they had in the beginning. For weeks after returning from Rome, she'd barely been able to speak about what happened without her voice breaking. The shame hadn't been about the money. That was just money, and she'd survived worse financial setbacks. The shame had been about David, about how thoroughly she'd failed to protect him from someone who saw his vulnerabilities as weapons to be used against their family. But therapy had helped. Dr. Martinez, a patient woman in her 50s who specialized in family trauma, had helped both Celia and David understand that manipulation was a form of psychological warfare, and that blaming the victims for being victimized only served the perpetrators. "The woman who targeted our family went by the name Sophia Reyes," Celia continued, clicking to the first slide of her presentation. "But she'd also used the identities Isabella Moreau, Catherine Dubois, and Maria Santos. Over 4 years, she systematically destroyed 11 families across 6 countries, stealing an estimated $38 million through romantic manipulation and financial fraud." An older man in the front row raised his hand. "What happened to her? Is she in prison?" Celia's expression tightened slightly. "Sophia is currently fighting extradition from Morocco, where she fled after our confrontation in Rome. The legal process is complicated. International fraud cases can take years to resolve, especially when the perpetrator has resources and sophisticated legal representation." What she didn't say, what she'd learned to keep to herself unless specifically asked, was that Sophia had managed to hide significant assets before her network was exposed. Even if they recovered every penny she'd stolen from the Williams family, the woman would likely emerge from whatever prison sentence she eventually received as a wealthy woman. The injustice of it still burned, but Celia had learned to focus her energy on things she could control, rather than outcomes that remained frustratingly uncertain. "The important thing," she continued, "is understanding how these predators work so we can protect ourselves and our families from becoming victims." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of David's manipulation. It had taken weeks of careful reconstruction, working with Detective Chen and a team of FBI behavioral analysts, to map out exactly how Sophia had identified, targeted, and gradually gained control over her son. "Phase 1 is always identification," Celia explained. "These criminals don't choose victims randomly. They research extensively, looking for people who are emotionally vulnerable, financially accessible, and socially isolated. My son David had recently lost his job, was struggling with feelings of inadequacy, and was going through a period where he was pulling away from family and friends." Mrs. Henderson, who ran the local library, leaned forward in her chair. "How do they find these people? How do they know who to target?" "Social media primarily. Dating apps, professional networking sites, even community Facebook groups. They study their targets for weeks or sometimes months before making contact, learning about family dynamics, financial situations, personal insecurities." Celia's voice carried the weight of hard-won knowledge. Sophia knew about David's college debt, his career struggles, his feelings about being a burden to me, even details about his father's death, all from information available online. The next hour passed quickly as Celia walked the group through the various phases of manipulation. The love-bombing period where victims are showered with attention and affection, the gradual isolation from family and friends, the introduction of financial opportunities that require access to family money, and finally, the systematic draining of assets while the victim believes they're participating. The most important thing to understand, she emphasized, is that these are not crimes of passion or desperation. They're calculated, professional operations run by people who view other human beings as resources to be harvested. The emotional manipulation is just as deliberate as the financial theft. After the formal presentation ended, people lingered for coffee and individual conversations. Celia found herself speaking with Maria Santos, a woman about her own age whose adult daughter had recently started dating a man who was pushing her to invest in cryptocurrency schemes. "It sounds so similar to what you described," Maria said worriedly. "The way he's convincing her that her family doesn't understand their relationship, that we're holding her back from financial success." "Trust your instincts," Celia advised. "And document everything. Take screenshots of social media profiles, keep records of unusual financial requests, maintain copies of any business documents they show her. Even if nothing comes of it, you'll have evidence if things go wrong." Quote. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the last participant left, and Celia began packing up her materials. The community center had agreed to host monthly workshops, and interest was growing. Detective Chen had helped her develop a curriculum that other communities could adapt, and they'd already received requests for training materials from victim advocacy groups in 3 states. The work was meaningful, but it was also emotionally exhausting. Every workshop brought her face to face with new victims, new variations on the same fundamental cruelty that had nearly destroyed her family. Some nights, she went home feeling like she was barely keeping ahead of a tide of predators who seemed to multiply faster than awareness could spread. But tonight felt different. Tonight she felt hopeful. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Just finished my shift. Want to grab dinner? I have news." Celia smiled, gathering her jacket and purse. David's news could be anything from a promotion at the accounting firm where he'd been working for 4 months to an update on his therapy sessions. He'd been rebuilding his life with the same methodical determination she'd once applied to saving money, taking each step carefully but steadily forward. The relationship between them had changed fundamentally. They no longer had the easy, unexamined dynamic of mother and child that had existed before Rome. Too much had happened, too many painful truths had been exposed, for them to return to their previous roles. But what they were building now felt stronger, more honest. A relationship between 2 adults who had survived something terrible together and chosen to keep choosing each other despite the damage. She found David waiting for her at Murphy's Diner, the same place where she'd worked double shifts for 15 years. He'd insisted on meeting there, despite the obvious discomfort it caused him to be surrounded by reminders of the sacrifices she'd made for his future. "You look tired," he said as she slid into the booth across from him. "Good tired," she replied. 23 people tonight. Mrs. Henderson thinks her nephew might be getting scammed by someone he met online." David nodded, understanding the weight of that responsibility. He'd been attending some of the workshops, sharing his perspective as someone who had been manipulated. It was difficult for him. The shame and guilt were still raw, but Dr. Martinez had convinced him that speaking about his experience was part of his healing process. "So what's your news?" Celia asked. David's expression brightened in a way she hadn't seen since before he'd met Sophia. "I got the promotion. Senior account analyst, 15% raise, full benefits package." "David, that's wonderful." The pride in her voice was genuine and uncomplicated. "You've worked so hard for this." "There's more," he said, pulling out his phone to show her a banking app. "I've been saving aggressively since I started working. Living in that tiny apartment, cooking every meal, taking the bus instead of buying a car. And with the promotion..." He paused, his voice becoming emotional. "Mom, I can start paying you back. Really paying you back, not just token amounts." Celia stared at the number on his screen. $28,000. In 4 months, working at an entry-level accounting job and living like a monk, her son had saved more money than she used to make in a year at the diner. "David, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm, carrying an authority she'd never heard from him before. "I stole from you. I let someone convince me that your life's work was worth less than her lies. I'm going to spend as long as it takes to make that right." The waitress came to take their order, giving Celia a moment to process the complexity of emotions David's announcement had triggered. Pride in his determination, guilt about the sacrifices he was making, hope about their financial future, and underneath it all, a deep sadness about the innocence they'd both lost in Rome. "There's something else," David said after they'd ordered. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Martinez said about turning our experience into something positive. About how healing doesn't just happen in therapy sessions. It happens when you take action." "What kind of action?" "I want to work with Detective Chen's task force. She says they need people who understand how these cons work from the inside. People who can help identify manipulation patterns and interview victims." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I know it means I'll have to keep talking about what happened, keep reliving it. But if I can help stop even one family from going through what we went through." Celia reached across the table and took his hand. 6 months ago, the gesture would have been maternal comfort offered to a confused child. Now it was solidarity between equals who had both paid a heavy price for hard-won wisdom. "I think that's exactly what you should do," she said. Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the familiar rhythm of small-town evening life through the diner's windows. Cedar Falls hadn't changed during Celia's European adventure, but her perspective on it had shifted dramatically. Where she'd once seen limitations and small-town narrowness, she now saw safety and community, people who knew each other's stories, who looked out for each other, who couldn't easily disappear or reinvent themselves as someone else. "Elena called this morning," David said eventually. "The hotel promoted her to general manager. She's implementing new training protocols for staff to recognize potential fraud schemes." Celia smiled. Elena had become an unexpected friend, someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be caught up in Sophia's web. They exchanged emails regularly, sharing updates about the ongoing legal proceedings and the slow process of rebuilding their sense of trust in other people. And Marco? The Italian authorities finally agreed to investigate the original charges against him. His lawyer thinks they can get the fraud conviction overturned within the year. David's expression grew thoughtful. He started a foundation to help families recover from financial manipulation. He wants to know if we'd be interested in serving on the advisory board. The idea appealed to Celia immediately. The elder fraud workshops were important, but they were reactive, trying to help people after they'd already been targeted. Marco's foundation could be proactive, developing resources for prevention and early intervention. What would that involve? Travel, mostly. Speaking engagements, training workshops, working with law enforcement agencies across Europe and North America. It would mean using our story to help other families, but on a much larger scale. Celia considered the prospect. 6 months ago, the idea of international travel would have terrified her. Now it felt like a natural extension of the work she was already doing. "We'd be doing it together?" she asked. "If you want to." Marco thinks our perspective as mother and son, as both victims and survivors, would be particularly valuable. "Then yes," Celia said without hesitation. "Let's do it." As they finished dinner and prepared to leave, Celia felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about the future. Not just relief that they'd survived their ordeal. Not just gratitude that they were rebuilding their relationship, but genuine enthusiasm for the work ahead of them. The money would come back eventually. Detective Chen's team had been making steady progress tracking Sophia's hidden assets. Their reputations had already been largely restored, thanks to the international media coverage of their confrontation in Rome. But more importantly, they had found purpose in their pain, a way to transform their worst experience into something that could help others. Walking out of Murphy's diner into the crisp autumn evening, Celia Williams felt truly free for the first time since discovering her empty bank accounts. Free from fear, free from shame, and free from the limitations she'd once placed on her own possibilities. She was 58 years old, had survived the worst betrayal imaginable, and was about to embark on a new chapter of her life that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The future, for the first time in months, looked bright. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,